Okay, today we have moved on to chapter number 3, Statistics for Economics, that is organization of data. So in the previous chapter, we have discussed about, the mode or different methods of collection of data. So how data are collected, that we have discussed in chapter number 2. So in this chapter number 3, we are going to discuss about how the data which are collected are to be organized, and why should we organize data. So we will see some of the reasons behind the organization of data. So in this chapter, when you study this chapter, you will have to know certain things about classification of data for further statistical analysis, and then you will be able to know the distinguishing characteristics between quantitative and qualitative classification, and also prepare a frequency distribution table. You will know the technique of forming classes. You will be familiar with the method of tally marking, and again you will differentiate between univariate and bivariate frequency distributions. So we'll come to know about all these topics. As I have mentioned in this chapter, you will know how the data that you have collected are to be classified, and what are the reasons that we are classifying data. So let's take an example of kabadiwala, or someone who is collecting your waste products, maybe plastics or newspapers. So this fellow, he purchases things from you and then sells them to those who recycle them. So but with so much junk in his shop, because he's collecting every waste product, it would be very difficult for him to manage his trade. If he had not organized them properly. So to ease his job or his situation, what does he do? He make them, or he arrange them in groups, or classifies them, those various junks. So he puts like all newspapers together and tie them in a rope, or he puts the empty glass bottles in a sack, and he classified them into groups like iron, copper, aluminum, etc., so on. So in this way, he groups his junk into different classes, newspapers, plastics, glass, metals, etc. So what is he doing? He is organizing or classifying the products that he has collected. So in doing so, he brings order in them. So it is easy for him to find out when a buyer comes and asks for a particular thing. So likewise, when you are arranging your school books in a certain order, it becomes easier for you to handle them. You can classify them into subject wise, and once you have classified that, it is easier for you to locate and pick up any book which you want. So when you need a particular book on history, for instance, what you all need to do is search in the group of history, and you will find it there. So while classification of objects or things saves our valuable time, it saves our time plus our effort. But while classification of object is done, they are not done anyhow, or it is not done in arbitrary manner, but it is done through certain criteria, following certain criteria. So you may ask, why do we classify object? Because it makes us easy to manage, reduce our time, effort. And classification is not done arbitrarily, which means that it is done based on certain criteria. So what is all about classification? So classification is therefore arranging or organizing things into groups, or classes based on some criteria. As I have mentioned, we are not classifying things arbitrarily or anyhow, but we are classifying them based on some criteria, the characteristics that follow. So certain objects which falls under certain criteria will keep will be kept together. So that is classification of data. So what do we mean by raw data? So raw data usually are highly disorganized. They are highly disorganized. They are usually large and cumbersome to handle. And we know we cannot draw any meaningful conclusion from this raw data. And it is a very tedious job to make any analysis or bring about meaningful, conclusion from this raw data. So raw data means, it is very disorganized, very large, that is why it is cumbersome to handle, and meaningful conclusion cannot be, taken out from this raw data. And it is a very tedious task to handle this raw data. That is why we classify this raw data into groups or classes based on certain criteria that they possess. So what we need to do is, after collection of data, our next step should be to organize them. And after organizing them, we have to present them in a classified form. So it should be classified into groups or classes. After collection, we organize them and it should be presented in a classified form. So let us take an example. Suppose you want to know the performance of a student in mathematics, and you have collected data on marks in mathematics of 100 students of your school. So let us see that in a tabular form. So this is the marks in mathematics obtained by 100 students in an examination. And another example of raw data is you are collecting, or you want to know the average income of a household, monthly household expenditures on food by 50 households. So you have collected this data, but these two data are raw data, and by looking at these data, you cannot, or it is very tedious task to to get meaningful conclusion from these data, because they are not classified or they are not arranged in order. That is why it is very difficult to bring out any understanding or analysis. We cannot do any analysis on this raw data, since they are just collected and presented in a raw manner. So both these tables 3.1 and 3.2 are raw or unclassified data. So since it is like unclassified data, it is a tedious task to pull information from this large unclassified data. So what do we have to do? We have to summarize. Raw data are summarized and made comprehensive by classification. So the table which I showed you is a raw data, and so what we have to do from the raw data is we have to summarize them and made comprehensive, through classification, into classification into many groups or into classes, or maybe finding out the frequencies, which you will learn in the coming lecture. So how you classify or how you group your data depends upon the purpose of your data. Suppose you want to know an information about the raw data, so your purpose, or your purpose, or what sort of information you want to draw from the data will determine your types of classification. And why are we summarizing and putting it in a comprehensive classification of the raw data? It is because when facts are of similar characteristics are placed in the same order, it enables one to locate them easily. It is very easy to locate and make comparison and and draw information without any difficulty. When we are classifying or putting them data according to their similar characteristics, and put it in the same class, it is very easy for us to locate, and we can also make comparisons, and we can draw information without any difficulty. That is why we classify data. So we have discussed or studied in chapter 2 that the government of India conducts census of population every 10 years. So in census 2001, about 20 crore persons were contacted. And imagine, the raw data of census are so large and they are fragmented that it appears an almost impossible task to draw any meaningful conclusion. So what do they do in census? When the same data is classified according to gender, their education, their marital status, occupation, etc., the structure and then the nature of the population of India is then easily understood. So when they are classified into gender, education, marital status, occupation, etc., which is done exactly in census, we can easily understand the nature and then the structure of the whole Indian population. So census can be example of a classification of a raw data, summarizing and comprehending the raw data, which is very large and cumbersome to handle. And by classifying them into different fields, we are able to withdraw, or we are able to draw meaningful conclusion for our further statistical analysis. And again, the raw data consists of observations on variables. So the mathematics teacher, as we have talked about the previous example, looking at those marks would be thinking, how have my students done? By looking at the raw data that he has collected, he will not be able to withdraw or draw any meaningful conclusions. If at all the teacher wants to find out the performance of his or her student. So how we classify the data depends on the purpose we have in mind, as I have mentioned. So in this case, if the teacher wishes to understand in some depth how these students have done, how far the students have done, she would probably choose to construct the frequency distribution of the marks of all the students. So frequency distribution we will discuss in the coming lecture. So classification of data, how do we classify? As we have mentioned, classification of data depends on our requirement or on the purpose. What purpose are we classifying? What purpose or in what field are we interested in this data will determine the basis of our classification. So there are different types of classification. One is chronological classification. So in this chronological classification, raw data is classified in various ways depending on the purposes. But under this chronological classification, the data are classified either in ascending or descending order with reference to time, such as years, quarters, months, weeks, etc. That is called chronological classification. And again, another type of classification is spatial classification. So in this spatial classification, the data are classified with reference to geographical locations such as cities, states, countries, districts, etc. So in this table they are giving the population of India in crores, so which is an example of a chronological classification. So the population is arranged in a year, so in a chronological manner from 1951, 61, 71. So it is arranged in a year chronological manner. So that is an example of a chronological classification. And again here, this is the example of a spatial classification where wheel of wheat is presented in a country wise. So with reference to the countries or region, it is given the amount of yield of wheat. that is given in the different countries, that is with reference to the countries. So this is an example of a spatial classification. And not only that, sometimes you will come across characteristics that cannot be expressed quantitatively, like those tables that we have seen just now. So such characteristics are called qualities or attributes. They are called attributes or qualities. For example, the nationality, the literacy, the religion, gender, marital status, etc. They will not be able to classify them into quantitative manner. So they are known as qualities or attributes. So they cannot be measured, yet these attributes can be again classified on the basis of either their presence or absence. So these qualities or attributes can be again measured, indicating their absence or presence of a qualitative characteristic. So such a classification data on attribute is called qualitative classification. So what is a qualitative classification? When classification of data is based on attributes, it is called qualitative classification. So in the following example, we will find the population of a country is grouped on the basis of qualitative variable, that is gender. So we shall see the example of a qualitative classification. Here it is given population is classified into male and female. So whether male is there or male is not there, it is presented here. So these are all attributes or example of a qualitative classification. So under this male, we are measuring married, how many married persons are there and how many unmarried. So because of their absence and presence, we are able to measure them. Even in female category, we are listing or classifying them into married and unmarried. So even in a qualitative classification, those attributes can be measured by listing or by referring to their absence or on the basis of their presence or absence. But they are all under qualitative classification. So those are some of the types of classification that you will see in statistics. But characteristics like weight, height, length are all grouped into classes. When they are grouped into classes, it becomes quantitative classification because they can be measured quantitatively, unlike qualitative classification.